When Washington told us not to meddle in the affairs of Europe, he meant, of course, not to meddle in their local quarrels and their rival ambitions. He did not mean that we should be provincial, isolated, or indifferent to the welfare of other nations. Our manifest destiny is not indefinite expansion, but indefinitely expanding brotherhood. Edward T. Devine, 1918.
Soft
power.
Powerful.
Soft
power.
Powerful stories.
Powerful.
Soft.
Powerful.
Stories.
Welcome to another bonus episode of Soft Powerful Stories. This episode is very much a companion piece to episode number 8 featuring Warren Acuncius, who spent years leading USAID teams into disaster areas. In order to get some historical perspective about how the United States has responded to disasters overseas, I spoke with Dr. Julia Irwin, a leading scholar on U.S. disaster relief. Julia is the T. Harry Williams Professor of History at Louisiana State University. Her most recent book, entitled Catastrophic Diplomacy, U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance in the American Century, is the go-to source for understanding the evolution of U.S. thinking and action following foreign disasters. She was kind enough to share some fascinating stories, starting at the very beginning of U.S. assistance overseas. And what did it look like when the U.S. for the very first time, provided disaster relief?
Yeah, so one of the things that surprised me and struck me was really how early it began. So my book actually begins in 1812, so not long after the United States became an independent country. There was a major earthquake in Caracas in Venezuela, which was in the midst, had launched an independence war from Spain. News of that disaster took a long time to reach the United States. It had to travel by boat, and it was a few months before news arrived in Washington that this earthquake had just destroyed Caracas. But the response was really interesting within the House of Representatives, the Senate. There's this sort of outpouring of concern and a desire to provide aid. A lot of that is the sort of humanitarian sympathies. It's also in the midst, as I said, of Venezuela's revolutionary war from Spain. And a lot of Americans at this time saw Venezuelans as fellow revolutionaries. They wanted to support this movement to create new republics in the Americas, to end other empires just as they had done. So they voted to send $50,000, which at the time was quite a lot of money, worth of relief supplies to Caracas. That ship also took a few months to arrive, so it was months between the onset of the disaster and the time the relief ship arrived. But it ended up marking the first official instance of the U.S. government committing relief to a disaster in another country. It was very much at the time a bit of a one-off. Most aid was coming through churches, charities, voluntary sort of society, if there was U.S. foreign aid at all. The real turning point begins in the late 19th or early 20th century. And it's this moment, the United States is at this point becoming really a world power for the first time and more important player on the global stage. Transportation and news are getting faster. There's more telegrams. There's more faster ships that are bringing news of foreign crises back to the United States. There's more Americans abroad than ever. They're abroad as missionaries. They're abroad as representatives of businesses. There's a growing number of diplomats abroad as well. And so it's in this moment that we start to see the U.S. government responding more to disasters abroad. A major turning point, though, comes during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency in the early 20th century. During his presidency, there were responses to volcanic eruption in Martinique, to earthquakes in Jamaica, and in Chile, and most notably to a really major earthquake and tsunami that struck southern Italy in 1908 at the end of Roosevelt's presidency. So this is really where we see the governments and its partners in the voluntary sector starting to respond to disasters on a more consistent, routine basis than they ever had before.
Was there ever a sense that far back that this was a message for the American people to be proud about, using our wealth and our influence to make people feel good about what we were doing?
I think then as now, there were always debates over foreign aid. But yes, there were a lot of positive messages. A lot of Americans were proud. They wrote into their elected officials. They wrote into the Department of State. Sometimes they wrote directly to the president himself, calling for aid. Sometimes it was because they had connections in other places. For instance, I just mentioned this disaster in southern Italy. There's a lot of Italian immigrants to the United States at this time, so they saw it as a way to help friends and family back home. But many Americans who had no real connections to other places saw this really as a way to define the United States as a different type of world power, a good world power on the international stage. So there was a lot of cognizance of it. And a lot of policymakers themselves saw this too. U.S. presidents became important spokesmen and fundraisers even for groups like the American Red Cross. They called on the American public to donate during times of foreign crises, and often the American public responded. But they used these messages, sort of saying, this is a way to help, to help other people, to show the benevolence of the United States as a new power in the world.
When you said there were arguments about foreign assistance, what were the arguments back then against foreign assistance?
Yeah, it's kind of remarkably similar then as now. Those same people, well, not the same people, but other people wrote to their elected officials, sort of saying things essentially like, we have too many problems at home. We need to focus here. There were concerns and certain catastrophes, especially about corruption or that aid would get lost or that it would get into the wrong hands. But I think, the largest was more this idea that we have problems at home, right? And that we need to focus on domestic issues rather than, or at least before we focus on the world. I would say in reading the letters, and there's, again, so many, the majority tended to be in favor. More letters tended to be supportive than in opposition in the case of most of the disasters that I'm looking at. World War I is this really fascinating moment in the history of U.S. foreign aid. Just to step back just a moment, the American Red Cross in the early 20th century really was, this is before USAID, before the U.S. government had any of its own foreign assistance agencies. The American Red Cross really served as the government's chosen partner in foreign aid from the early 20th century on. Down the hall from the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and Navy were the American Red Cross's offices. They met often to decide responses to foreign disasters, to other crises. The presidents of the U.S., as I mentioned, were spokesmen, avid spokesmen for the American Red Cross. And so we have this kind of moment starting in the early 20th century where the Red Cross is really playing this role as, kind of this prototype in some ways to USAID, to other government assistance agencies. It had started, the American Red Cross was founded in 1881. It really started growing in the early 20th century, but it was not until World War I, and especially after the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, that the American Red Cross really saw its membership and its funding explode. In 1917 and 18 alone, the American Red Cross raised over $400 million. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Come for us, Rickard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Some of that certainly was for U.S. soldiers, so it went to U.S. troops and it went to kind of activities on the home front, but much of it was also for foreign assistance. Some of that went to Allied soldiers and hospitals and ambulances, kind of memorialized in things like Farewell to Arms by Hemingway, who himself was a Red Cross ambulance driver. But a lot of it, and what I really wrote my first book about, was civilian assistance. It was aid to non-combatants in all sorts of forms. Some of it was more emergency relief in the terms in food, shelter, assistance to refugees. But the American Red Cross just had so much money that it began to experiment with other much more substantial forms of recovery and reconstruction assistance in France and Italy and in 25 countries in total throughout Europe and the Near East. They built orphanages. They built schools for children who had been displaced by the war. They created workshops for women, especially, who were to give them sort of employment. They helped rebuild cities. They just did this extraordinary amount of activities. It did, I think, create major precedents for the century that followed in terms of U.S. foreign aid.
Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Bolivian? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Well, is it fair to say that what grew out of these disaster relief efforts became kind of early template of international development work, it sounds like to me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I write about that, in my book. They didn't call it development work at the time, but often it sure looked like the sort of predecessors to what we would later call development. In 1917, there was a major earthquake in Guatemala. In 1931, another one in Nicaragua. The U.S. government, the U.S. military, the American Red Cross responded to these disasters. Initially, as you might expect, it was providing food and emergency relief, but they remained involved in these operations for months. And took part in activities like helping to rebuild the water supply system, but not only rebuild it, building a new chlorinated water supply system, so kind of ensuring better water moving forward. In other places, in China, for instance, in 1917, they organized road building as a form of relief. So the idea was that people who were displaced by flooding and also had lost their jobs, their income, could make money and gain food and rations for their families by taking part in road building projects. But the idea was also to leave a sort of lasting testament, right, to this relief work. It wasn't simply short-term relief, but creating new and better structures in the years that followed. So I think we do see these moments, the beginnings of thinking about the longer term impacts and the ways that relief and development began to intertwine as early as the 19-teens and 20s.
And I'm curious, do you start seeing kind of pragmatic thinking or philosophy about U.S. security or U.S. wealth and power in the form of helping other people, in the form of kind of soft power?
Yeah, absolutely. There were always humanitarian motivations, and I like to stress that. A lot of it was about doing good, as we talked about, using U.S. wealth and U.S. largesse to do good in the world. But throughout, there were also a lot of strategic motivations. Diplomats and consuls, for instance, would write back to Washington and say, there's a flood, there's an earthquake, we need you to send assistance because it's creating unrest in the area. There's a lot of concern at this time with the potential for communism or radicalism, and this idea that if we provide aid to people who are displaced, it will perhaps provide a buffer against people turning to communist ideas or parties. So that was a major concern. There were concerns certainly about the economic impacts. Much of the disaster aid that the United States delivered was going to places where the United States had a lot of investments. American landowners and business owners and things like oil, bananas and things like this, bananas, coffee, and in the Americas. So if a disaster hit, if a hurricane, for instance, struck the Caribbean or Central America, often workers on American plantations were displaced. Often the land itself was affected. So the idea was to get economics going again, to get normal trade patterns, to get things back to work, which would serve American interests as well. And then in general, just the idea of soft power, U.S. officials wanting to project their nation as a better world power than its competitors. So there's a lot of interest in how much money other major powers are giving to disasters. How much is England giving? How much is France giving? Are we giving as much? This really becomes a major issue as the Cold War sets in. There's a lot of concern about how much aid the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries are giving to other countries. And the United States officials are very interested in making sure that they are giving more and giving more visibly than their rivals. So this becomes a major concern as well.
So you, in 11 minutes, just very, very articulately, just kind of got us to the middle of the last century. But now, kind of more fun. Do you have some favorite anecdotes or stories from along kind of some of those earlier efforts?
Yeah. I have so many stories. I think the disaster that really got me first thinking about this was, as I mentioned, that earthquake and tsunami in southern Italy. And as I started researching that disaster, I was just struck by how involved the United States was and for how long. The disaster happened in late 1908, and it just so happened that at the time it hit, the Great White Fleet that Theodore Roosevelt had sent around the world on a worldwide either goodwill tour or show of force, depending on your perspective, was nearby. It had entered the Gulf of Aden. It was on its way through the Mediterranean, or moving towards the Mediterranean, towards home finally. And this earthquake strikes. The U.S. military, the U.S. Navy diverts 4 of its battleships to southern Italy. So you have all of these U.S. Navy personnel assisting the Italian Navy, the Italian government, and other governments in responding, digging people out of the rubble, trying to respond to this just immense, massive disaster. There's a lot of good reports that came out. I also happened to find a lot of reports of sailors who were disciplined for getting drunk on shore leave. So there were a lot of, for all the good they were doing, as you can imagine, right there, they were also using it as an opportunity for fun, for carousing. There's a lot of other instances like that. But this disaster response, which started with the Navy's response and the U.S. military, it evolved into essentially a 6-month relief and recovery operation. And some of the things that they did were just extraordinary. They built dozens of cottages, hundreds of cottages for people living in the area to have new homes. Congress gave $800,000, a lot of money at the time. The American Red Cross gave about the equivalent, raised all this money. And it was meant to help rehouse people. But they also did other things. They started an orphanage that was a farm colony. So this idea was that children who had been orphaned during this disaster could go and learn how to be farmers and could at least have some sort of a future. They built a hospital named after Italy's queen. And then sort of most interestingly, they decided to build a hotel. The idea was to restore tourism to the region. So again, thinking about this development work, this idea that we're going to build this grand hotel in southern Italy and this is going to be part of our relief response. So it's this really interesting, just kind of fascinating moment. But they stayed involved, again, for about 6 to 8 months in the immediate aftermath. But some of these projects continued for years. And then one of the really striking things, during World War I, the American Red Cross comes back to Italy, and the national director at the time shows up in southern Italy where this earthquake had happened a decade before, and he finds these cottages still standing. And the street names are things like via Roosevelt, via Taft. So it's like this really fascinating kind of lasting impact of this relief response. The experimental nature of this at this time when this wasn't necessarily a normal routine thing, but that also really set precedents for later relief work.
At the same time that we were doing all of this interesting work in Italy, Italian Americans were not being super welcome in the United States. They were kind of on the lower tier of the immigrants coming in. Was there any effort to educate Americans about Italians, or any effort to make people realize that we need to be helping them and maybe their image improved in the United States?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. And I think this one is interesting precisely for that reason. There's a lot of, this is a time when there's calls for immigration restriction. Some of the first immigration restriction laws have recently been passed against the Chinese, sort of a gentleman's agreement against the Japanese. But there's similar calls to limit Italian immigration, at least on some part of the U.S. On the other part of the U.S., though, you also have, you have many Italian immigrants and their families who clearly are more supportive, but also a lot of, I guess, what I would call Italophilic Americans who see in Italy the art, the culture, and believe, want those sorts of, connections, both cultural and sort of personal connections with the country. So it's, there are certainly divides and debates, I think, over Italian immigration at this point. The relief response, the American Red Cross raises more money to respond to this disaster than any foreign disaster, at least in its history. So it's been around for about 30 years by this point, and it's the largest. So this is an indication, at least, I think, that at least many Americans are willing to provide aid, provide support. And there are instances of seeing at least people using this as a chance to say, this is a fellow, this is a sister country that we need to help. Many Italians are part of our community. They're immigrants, but they're also citizens. And this is a chance to help. There were instances, though, and of less sort of less savory stories. I remember one of the consuls, especially on the ground, was very critical. He was certainly complaining and using a lot of the stereotypes people in the United States were using against Italian immigrants, calling them lazy, calling them sort of corrupt. This idea that they were taking American aid. This man who was there supposedly to be helping on the ground is secretly in his letters and his diaries and completely critical of the people he's there to help. But there were many others who were not, and who were much more, I think, less the ugly American than he was. So it's as it is now. Again, these debates over, what should we be doing with American money and American aid were certainly there as well. One of the other just major catastrophes was in Tokyo and Yokohama. There was an earthquake there in 1923. So it was September 1923. And this disaster, too, became just this immense response. Calvin Coolidge had recently become president just a few days before with the unexpected, untimely death of Warren G. Harding. And so he's president, and all of a sudden this just immense, not only earthquake, but also fire destroys almost the entirety of Yokohama, about 2/3 of Tokyo. Millions of people are displaced, killed. There's a number of refugees as well. And the U.S. response to this disaster in particular just fascinated me. U.S.-Japanese relations at this time were not at a very good place. There's a lot of tensions between the two countries over various things, settlements after World War I. Japan sort of sensed the United States was treating it as a junior sort of power on the world stage at this moment when the Japanese Empire is trying to expand. It's a moment when the United States is there's a large anti-Japanese movement population in the U.S. against Japanese immigrants, but also against further immigration. So just a lot of tensions. So this earthquake strikes, and you might expect that there wouldn't be much of a response. But in fact, this response, even compared to the Messina one that I just mentioned, was even larger. The amount of money, the American Red Cross itself raised about $11 million from the public. The U.S. government provided a lot of assistance through the military, through other sorts of forms of aid. But what really struck me about this disaster was the ambassador on the ground at the time. His name was Cyrus Woods. Was really this just example of someone who understood that this was a moment to build better relations. In a lot of previous disasters, the United States had kept a really tight control over its aid to make sure it didn't get into wrong hands. So U.S. diplomats or consuls were the ones who were entrusted with that aid. But he said, no, we're going to trust the Japanese Red Cross, the Japanese government, as our partners in this. We're going to work with them, essentially, instead of dictating how aid should be distributed. And he gained just a lot of support. There were this outpouring of support for the U.S., for its policies, that ended up, at least for the short term, leaning to kind of large-scale improvements in U.S.-Japanese relations. With all the aid that it raised, the U.S. did a lot of medical relief work. So it loaned doctors and nurses, but it also helped to build a number of temporary hospitals, and then a permanent hospital that the American Red Cross helped to endow that was meant to be, I forget the exact name, but the name was essentially translated to the Japanese-American Friendship Hospital, with this idea of leaving, again, this lasting monument to American aid. So it's this really kind of beautiful moment. And then, again, this Ambassador Woods really, I think, exemplified, he understood soft power and how it worked, and wanted to in his words, make the most of this opportunity to improve U.S.-Japanese relations, and I think did in many ways.
In the evolution of our disaster relief, was there a moment where that kind of became the template from which, we had learned this works, and this works, and so X would happen, and then we would just go into that motion?
One of the things that struck me was how ad hoc a lot of the responses were. Especially in the early days, a lot of it depended on the whims of donors, right? How much money were the Americans willing to give to the American Red Cross in any given disaster? Was Congress in session? Because at this point, there was no sort of permanent relief fund. Congress had to vote on whether to authorize funds or appropriate funds when a disaster happened. So on certain occasions, they didn't happen to be in session when a disaster happened, and there was no sort of mechanism to respond. As we move forward, though, people start to compare what was happening to previous disasters. So there's learning, there's knowledge. So you see a lot of references to Messina, the earthquake I mentioned, to Japan later on. There's references to domestic disasters as well. So there's a sense that the 1906 San Francisco earthquake or the 1927 Mississippi River floods, which were major domestic disasters, had left precedents for disaster relief work abroad, too. You really start to see, though, more standardization beginning in the decades after World War II. So we often, we would think of USAID as the major turning point in 1961. But even in the 40s and 50s, USAID's predecessor organizations, so these are things like the Foreign Operations Administration, the Point 4 program that Truman created, the International Cooperation Administration under Eisenhower, these agencies started to do more planning, more sort of thinking systematically, right, about how do we respond to disasters. In 1958, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, created the first kind of official memorandum about what the U.S. government should do when a disaster happens. So it started creating rules, expectations, obligations, say, for the ambassador on the ground or the lead diplomat on the ground to, when a disaster happens, here's the checklist of things that you need to do. You should write back to us and tell us how many are displaced, how much money you think you might need. Would it be in the national interest of the United States to respond? This is a question diplomats need to answer. But even still, with all of that, things remain fairly ad hoc. It's not until 1964 that what became OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, was created. And initially, it's run by one person and a staff of 3. So it's responsible for responding to all these disasters everywhere.
Like today.
So yeah, it's I know we're back to 1964 numbers, sadly. But this is the beginnings, I think, of beginning to become more systematized. One thing that really struck me, it's not until 1975 that language about international disasters is finally added to the Foreign Assistance Act. Congress in 1975 revises the Foreign Assistance Act to add a specific chapter and language about international disaster assistance. So again, before this, it had been ad hoc, and I think a lot of the push for it was saying, we've been doing this for decades. One of the quotes I remember was a military official, I think this was in the 50s or 60s, early 60s, but he said, the U.S. military is accused of doing a lot of illegal things, but I think the most illegal things we do are in disaster response because none of this is authorized, right? So there is a sense within the diplomatic community and the aid community especially that there needs to be some more systematization and making this more official. And that, again, is finally sort of done in the 1970s.
So you talked about Messina and Japan. I'm wondering if you can think of a story where there was a kind of a swing and a miss, where it just didn't work.
In 1963, a hurricane called Flora hit several Caribbean countries, but it caused the greatest disasters, or triggered the greatest disasters, in Haiti and in Cuba. U.S.-Cuban relations, let's just say, they were not at a good place. The Cuban Revolution had happened in 1959. The Bay of Pigs invasion was in 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It's peak hostilities between the two countries. So Hurricane Flora hits. It's a pretty major disaster for Cuba. And U.S. officials in the State Department are absolutely eager to respond. They see it as a way to show the Cuban people that the United States has their backs. They really define it in propaganda terms. This made me laugh out loud when I was in the archives reading it. But the National Security Advisor's kind of chief for Latin American affairs at the time, he said, and this is a quote, "It will make us look like the goody and Castro like the baddie." Like this is eloquent sort of intelligence analysis. But so this is the mentality. So despite, embargoes, export controls, everything, they authorized the American Red Cross to make an offer of aid to Cuba a couple days after the hurricane. The American Red Cross makes this offer. 2 days later, the Cuban Red Cross writes back with this very brusque refusal saying, we find this very strange that for the past few years you've been trying to completely destroy our country and now you want to provide us aid. Castro follows this up with a speech on the docks of Havana, and he says, this is a quote. He says, "They're trying to dress up the beast of imperialism and make it look like a sweet kitten." which is just incredible, right? So they refuse U.S. aid, end up accepting aid from other countries, including U.S. NATO allies, but of course the Soviet Union as well. And despite all this, the U.S. government still wants to get aid into Cuba for the same reasons. And what ends up happening, and I think this is a really just fascinating moment, the American Friends Service Committee, so the Quakers, essentially come to the government and say, can we try, right? So they have this long history of being more neutral in aid, being this kind of interesting kind of politics of Quaker aid. And the U.S. government agrees, and they're able to negotiate an agreement through back channels with the Cuban government. The Cuban government agrees to allow 4 American Quakers to arrive to come to Havana on the condition that all of the aid must be privately donated. So it cannot be from the U.S. government or the American Red Cross, notably. And the U.S. government in turn agrees to grant visas and then relax the controls so that these people can go. So they go. It's about a month and a half after the hurricane, but arrive in Havana on a small chartered plane with about $92,000 worth of food and medical supplies that they then distribute. That's the only authorized U.S. aid to Cuba in this moment. But yeah, it's just this really fascinating moment of, I think, Cold War diplomacy over disaster aid.
This notion of the transactional quality of disaster relief, and why I guess some people think that when they hear the word transactional that it's a bad word. And I wanted to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that I've always said, I think that disaster relief and humanitarian aid more broadly, I think it's important to recognize both the humanitarian motivations behind it, which are very real. And I think some scholars of humanitarian aid often just sort of talk about it as a tool of power and ignore the real humanitarian motivations. But also, at the same time, there are these sort of transactional. The reason that Congress has historically approved aid budgets and decided on aid is not simply because people want to do good in the world. Some of them do, but they see it as a national interest for the United States, for U.S. security, especially as we move into the kind of post-World War II period. It's really beneficial to American farmers. So with the beginnings of PL 480, which became Food for Peace, this recognition that by providing assistance to other countries, you can also help American farmers by disposing of surplus crops at sort of lower prices. This is a win-win. It's presented essentially as a win-win for other countries and for American farmers. So there is this, I think, sense of the economic benefits, those transactional benefits, but then also I think going, this idea that disaster relief will benefit the U.S. economy and the U.S. state in all sorts of ways. The issue of tide aid, for instance, a lot of the aid that is sent abroad during the 20th century into the 21st is required to be on American flag carriers. Aid dollars are often required to be spent back in the U.S. or to essentially purchasing U.S. goods. And then there are also ways that this aid becomes a form of leverage, essentially. This idea that, there are strings attached, or that, governments and populations need to sort of behave in certain ways or make certain agreements in order to get American assistance. So yeah, there has been a lot of these transactional impulses as part of it too. So that has a long history for sure.
One of the things that I've been doing lately, as I've been talking to, especially to USAID folks, and asking them about some of their proudest achievements, is a kind of it's a wonderful life approach of what does it look like when we weren't there. Given all of your research and your expertise, I'm curious if you can describe what the opposite of being there might look like.
This is a great question. So before 2025, when I've been a historian of foreign aid for a long time, I've given a lot of talks, and I often give talks to college students who are critical, right? So and I talk about the politics of aid, right? So this is aid is political in the ways that we've discussed. But they ask me questions similar to this. Is this U.S. imperialism? Is this And I say, well, there's a politics of responding, but there's also a politics of not responding. I think we're certainly seeing this now in 2025. But the decision not to use U.S. wealth, the U.S. economic might to respond to disasters has incredible implications. And we're seeing this now in 2025 in ways that, I don't probably need to describe to your listeners. But I think if we think back to the historical precedents, right, that I look at, certainly there are moments where the U.S. government or the American Red Cross was not able to raise enough money or not able to get kind of Congress to agree, where people went hungry. Relief didn't come. The U.S. became such an important player in the international humanitarian system in terms of the dollars, the food, the medicines, the pharmacological supplies, the medical and surgical supplies. That without it, it's really hard to imagine. And we've already seen, I think, the funding gap, the humanitarian funding gap in the world growing even before 2025. The needs of people throughout the world and the amount given has been shrinking. Or the gap has been widening, over the past few years. And certainly there's a major chasm at the moment. And a lot of that is because the international system has become so reliant, I think, on American aid participating in it. But it has real effects. People are left without food and without medicine and without relief. And we're only beginning to sort of see the ripple effects that I think this is going to have.
I feel like I'm ending on a really, really, it's fitting, I guess, to end on a bad note. But as climate change seems to increase the intensity and the incidences of these natural disasters around the world, what do you speculate? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, well, let's see how to. Assuming predictions are correct, which I do, right, we will see more sea level rise, rising heat levels in many countries, more powerful tropical storms. I mean, we're seeing all of this, and it's going to have major effects on populations, especially in coastal communities, but also in places, as we saw in North Carolina, right? You're not safe just because you're in the mountains. Heat is going to become a major issue in terms of health and humanitarian needs. So I think we're going to see unfortunately, growing need at a time of decreasing international and national support for foreign assistance. But I think, and I'll to end on a positive note, I think one of the trends I think that we have been seeing, and some of it's rhetorical, but I think there's a reality to it, is an emphasis on, I guess, what the aid community calls localization, right? This idea, and the truth is, I've been talking about U.S. foreign aid and international aid, but the truth is, in any crisis, in any disaster, the people doing the most work are the people on the ground, right? They're helping each other, they're supporting their neighbors and their communities and their families. Many, when we think about the international aid sector, many of the people working for it are locals in their own countries, right? So I think, maybe a positive or at least an optimistic hope, right, is that that focus on the local levels we've seen for the past past decade at least, will be something that will help to at least steel people against these crises, right? The solidarity among communities, neighbors, friends, families, is what we have to focus on to get us through the crises ahead. So I think if we can think about ways to strengthen or at least to support that local forms of response, perhaps that's the way we need to think about moving forward.
Thank you for being able to spin that around to a positive.
Try my best.
We're all screwed. Is a bad way to end. But when I used to speak with foreign exchange students, Fulbrighters and international visitors and things like that, it was these really ingenious local community efforts that it often inspired them the most, and then they would go back home empowered to feel like they could implement that kind of change in their own communities. And I 100% agree. And I think that the U.S. is actually a shining example in a lot of times of that. Thank you so much for your time. It went really fast. It was really fascinating.
Thank you.
Huge thank you to Julia for taking the time to share her stories with us and so much fascinating history. Julia Irwin is the T. Harry Williams Professor of History at Louisiana State University. She earned her PhD in history from Yale University. Her research focuses on the place of humanitarian assistance in 20th century U.S. foreign relations and international history. Her first book, Making the World Safe, The American Red Cross and a Nation's Humanitarian Awakening, is a history of U.S. relief efforts during World War I. Her next book, Catastrophic Diplomacy, U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance in the American Century, is a history of U.S. foreign disaster assistance and emergency relief in the 20th century. Currently, she's writing Humanitarianism, a very short introduction, a sweeping history of international humanitarianism over the past 3 centuries. She's also the founding co-editor of the book series Interconnections and a founding co-editor of the Journal of Disaster Studies. To learn more about Julia's research, please visit her website at julia-irwin.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back on Friday with a regular episode. Along with our soft, powerful storytellers, we believe fervently in the importance of constructive U.S. engagement with the rest of the world. If you enjoyed these stories, this history, I have a small ask. Like the show, follow the show, leave a review. Reviews count so much in helping the algorithms point this show to the ears that need to hear it most. And give us your feedback. Visit www.softpowerfulstories.org for a chance to leave reviews, to see pictures, to check out lots of stuff around these episodes, and of course, to get in touch with us. Our show's logo was designed by the incredibly talented Kate Furby. My friend Kathy Zilski voices Dubious Aunt Deb. She's nothing like Dubious Aunt Deb, but she plays her to perfection. I'm the host and creator of Soft Powerful Stories, Christopher Wurst. Until next time.
Here we are, here we are, here we are again. There's Pat and Mac and Tommy and Jack and Joe. When there's trouble brewing, when there's something doing, are we down our set? No, let them all come. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. We're fit and well and feeling as right as rain. Never mind the weather, now they're all together.